Okay, today is session 2 of the Great Women Get to Vote, and it's provided by the grant from the New York Humanities program. And so we have Joe again for session 2. And last week, those of you that were here, remember he gave us some background information about what was going on during this time. It was slavery, the Western movement, the Mexican-American War had ended, and everybody was starting to travel west on the Oregon Trail. So I'll let Joe take over from here.
Thank you very much. Hello, how's everybody?
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
I always start off all these sessions with, are there any questions, comments that you had from last week, stuff that you maybe thought about and you have a question or comment about?
That treaty, how do you pronounce that treaty and how did that name come up?
The treaty is Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it's from Mexico. It's a region and towns in Mexico.
Oh, okay.
So they got that treaty. And Texas too. Yeah, so it made sense to me. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
We talked about Elizabeth Cady Stanton last week, right?
We're going to talk about her again too.
Right, and I don't know if you saw in the news that there was this massive amount of people who had went to her grave this past week.
Yes, I did see
and
it.
all put stickers
I did
up
see
on,
it.
and
I
they put a
voted.
special thing on it.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought that was
wonderful.
I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah.
I thought that was really very moving
Yeah.
that people would do that.
Yeah.
Yes. They actually put different screens on it now,
Right, so it
they can
wouldn't
do it
be-
and it wouldn't
Right.
detract from the actual gravestone.
One woman had shown her crying.
Yeah.
She was so
Oh yeah,
happy
they were
to
so
be
moved.
there.
Yeah. Well, and I said this in the beginning when we started, you know, as a man, they never talked about this when we were in high school and college and even graduate school. They didn't talk much about it. It was later that there were the new authors. In the last 15, 20 years, there have been a lot of female authors in history and other fields who have written about this stuff. But it really was not an unknown subject, but one that was never highlighted. I think it's true. It's true when I was in school. I'm sure when all of you were in school, I mean, it was the same thing. We never learned about that stuff. But of course, we never learned about stuff that was happening among the African American community in the United States. We didn't learn about things that were happening to the Native Americans, or if we did, it was a very one-sided report about what was happening. So that's good that we've evolved. It's bad that it was like that for so long, but it's good that it's evolved like that. Now, one of the books I recommended to you, as a matter of fact, if you remember, was basically a history of the United States, but it was written by a woman by the name of Jill Lepore, who's a noted historian, and it's a textbook. It's an American history textbook, but it's told from a perspective that I think none of us is used to. Mentions women, mentions a lot of African Americans, highlights, and it's not made up. She didn't make this stuff up, but the emphasis is different. So it seems like, wait a minute, this is American history? Yes, this is absolutely American history, told a little bit more completely than it's ever been told. I'm hoping that we're doing a little bit of that here too. Anyway, I hear bells and whistles, it's good. Anyway, so any other questions, comments, observations? Okay, we left off the last time, and I just want to start from where we left off, talking about Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was really, she was an English woman who was very, very much involved in English efforts at moving the calendar a little bit more advanced so that women had more of a role in English politics and English life. We're going to talk about her a little bit later on, because obviously, like everything else, we derive and inherit so much from Great Britain. This too was something that we inherited from Great Britain. Not that it wasn't present in the United States, but there's a very, very interesting juxtaposition between what the English were doing, what we were doing. The English movement was very, very much more militant than ours was, until American women started to visit England, come back and forth, and then we'll see how it turns a little bit more militant in the United States, and it's due almost totally because of her and people like her. a group of women, the Pankhurst family, mother and daughters. We'll talk about them a little bit later on. Anyway, I wanted to start with that. But the emphasis of today is about this. This is, huh?
Hold on. I went too fast. There we go.
Is about this, and you've all, I guess, heard about this. The Seneca Falls Convention. The first women's convention, it says right here, the first women's convention, July 19th and 20th, 1848. 1848 is a very significant year in terms of all the stuff that we're talking about. As Doris was saying before, it was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. A war that most historians agree was a war that was initiated, started, propagated by the United States, by our president in particular, at the time, James Knox Polk, who perpetrated, you saw a little signal that I was walking too far, thank you. She's very subtle, you know, banging on the table, she's good. I know it was my fault, I sold you out. Anyway, James Knox Polk was president of the United States at the time. He had southern roots, and he was hell-bent on acquiring a lot of Mexican territory, mainly Texas. You know, that was the time that Texas was looking for independence for itself, but California in particular too. He wanted what the wealth. He wanted the room because people were getting very, very much crowded on the eastern seaboard of the United States. They were looking towards what were Native American and Mexican lands, actually, and they had already started to infiltrate to the west, and he wanted it to be official so that the United States would in fact spread from sea to shining sea, which was a movement, philosophical / religious movement at the time. It was a movement that the slave South in particular, because slavery existed in the South, it existed everywhere, and it was ended in the North about the 1820s. But it prevailed in the South, and you all know this too. You've heard this before. The cotton industry, cotton, tobacco, a lot of those industries needed slave labor to be profitable. If you don't pay your workers a lot, you make more money for yourself. So it worked out perfectly for that. And then, of course, there were the other ramifications of slavery, the other implications, much more significant implications, that African Americans were less than human, that it was not only logically but religiously emphasized that it was all right. You know, after all, they talk about slavery in the Bible, so it must be all right, the Judeo-Christian Bible. So all of those things militated towards making slaves of Africans in particular. Anyway, Seneca Falls, so significant for a number of reasons. Number one, the first time ever that officially there was a women's meeting like this that was attended by some men as well as women. And of the four great, they say many historians say the four great leaders of the women's movement in the United States, two of them were at Seneca Falls, and the other two would be apprised, right? Did you have a question? I'm
No.
sorry. Would be apprised of what was going on there. But so Seneca Falls. Okay, you can go to the next one.
Can I ask,
Yes.
how did it end up in Seneca Falls, New York?
That's a really good question, and it brings us to another innovation that was happening around this time. So you've all heard of the Erie Canal.
Mm-hmm.
And the Erie Canal opened up the northern part of of New York in particular, and was a new route out to the west. Now, before this time, if anybody wanted to move goods anywhere, you used wagons, you used wagon trains, you used, if you were near the coast, you would use a boat near the coast, a ship near the coast. It was relatively expensive, it was relatively time-consuming, and it got more and more dangerous as Native American peoples were pushed further and further away. They pushed back, and so moving out west like that on wagon trains, etc., was much, much more dangerous. And they weren't going far, not yet, but it was an expensive proposition and a dangerous proposition. Canals had been used in canals. So a canal is basically a waterway that connects two bodies of water, two bigger bodies of water. So canals had been used in Europe and parts of Eastern Asia and stuff for years before that, and Americans started to experiment with it and to use them. And the Erie Canal was this very, very ambitious project to send this major waterway up the coast of New York and out into the west. Once it was completed, it made the movement of all those goods much, much cheaper and much less dangerous. So you ask why Seneca Falls. I think because that region of New York State in particular was becoming more populated, more newsworthy, if you will, and that was a region that was, frankly, more welcoming of them to be able to have a meeting. So for all those reasons, they picked Seneca Falls.
Excuse me, wasn't somebody, was it Elizabeth Cady Stanton born in Rochester?
Well, the other thing was, yes, the other thing was that a lot of the leaders were born in New York, were New Yorkers, essentially. The other thing, and I'm glad you reminded me about that, ma'am. The other thing was, there was a lot of connection between Quakers, the Quaker philosophy / religion, and the women's movement. And you'll see, as we talk about this, a lot of the leading women in this, and as well as some of the men, were Quakers. A Christian sect that was pacifist for the most part, some of which was very, very accepting of women and accepting of women's rights. And it went perfectly hand in hand with what was going on here. So like I say, two of the leaders were there, two of the leaders were not. The next slide, the next slide, we'll come back to that. Go to the next slide first. So probably the most significant, and I would venture to say this is something in historic. You might get an argument about this from some people, but I think one of the most significant women leaders of the women's movement was this lady, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So just let it sink in, 1815 to 1902. I mean, she lived a pretty long life, especially for that time. So note this, because it becomes very significant later on. A white woman, and a woman of some privilege. She was born into an upper class household. She wrote something, you go back to the other thing now. She wrote this document called the Declaration of Sentiments. If you've ever read the Declaration of Sentiments, it reads very, very much like the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. And she says very much that she framed it on Thomas Jefferson's writings at the time of the Declaration. But for the first time, they start talking about women. Not all men are created, but all men and women are created equal. They have inalienable rights. Yeah, women too have inalienable rights. And that's the first time ever that this appeared in any American documents anywhere. Seneca Falls, just 3 hours northwest of here. This is where it all happened. And the question you asked is a good one. Those are the reasons. Those are some of the reasons. Now, there was another meeting about 2 years later in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Love it? Do we have it? Okay. National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester. And you'll see here that's very significant is black women and white women together. And what else was very significant is that Douglass, remember we talked about him, probably one of the most significant figures of the 19th century, escaped slave major abolitionists, anti-slavery abolitionists, would talk to people like Abraham Lincoln and people like that. And Douglass was super sympathetic to the women's cause, but it's very, very significant to remember that as far as he was concerned, abolition was more important. We can talk about women's suffrage, for sure. I adapt to it, I accept it, I'm in favor of it, but after black men are free. Black men and women are free. So there was a little bit of a conflict. And very early on in the women's movement, all these people who were very, very much involved with, and remember we said last week, there were a lot of reform movements from the 1840s to the 1860s. And oftentimes what would happen, and I use the example of, if you lived then and you went to a women's rights meeting, you'd recognize a lot of people. Not just because they went to those, but, oh, I saw you at the abolitionist meeting. I saw you at the meeting for safer insane asylums. I saw you, people who were into reform and thought there should be reform were involved in it on very, very many levels. And the same thing is true here. What's interesting about Worcester, other than Seneca Falls, is that it's co-ed, so to speak. There were men and women, and there were black women that were involved. You can go back to where we were, to Caddy Stanton. So, Caddy Stanton, again, one of the most significant. The next one, I think, is Lucretia Mott. Now, she was another major, if we can say fathers of the revolution, we can say mothers of the women's movement, that was at Seneca Falls. And very, very much, very, very good friends, met Caddy Stanton at Seneca Falls, and they became friends for life, for the rest of their lives. The other two women who were not there, but who are, as you'll see, very significant, was this lady, Lucy Stone, who we'll talk about a little bit later, and finally, Susan B. Anthony, who is much more famous, even to a lot of male audiences. You know, she was a very, very famous person that was heard of. So now, as this is happening, and people are starting to refer to Seneca Falls, remember, even in this age where we don't have the kind of news coverage, the kind of 24-hour news that we have now, which is also revolutionary and unheard of at this point. But still, people began to hear about this. People began to hear people actually read the Declaration of Sentiments. People used to think about the possibilities of this. There was still a lot of resistance to women's rights in this area, to women being able to work where they wanted to, with women particularly getting the vote, a lot of resistance. But there were some people who were becoming very, very much more sympathetic to it, and there were many more women who wanted to be a part of it, who believed in it and wanted to be a part of it. So the next one we have is, the National Women's Rights. Okay, we talked about that. This is part of it, and I wanted to show this image in particular because you see some of the men, they're kind of smirking about this. These guys over here. The woman's blindfolded, and it's justice, right? Justice is blindfold. We have that same image in our courtrooms today. And the police kind of preventing the women with a club, right? He's got a club and he's holding it. This was all going on. This was not hyperbole. This was not just an illustration. All of these kinds of things were going on during this time. Yes. And along came some of these other women. A kind of interesting side note, Amelia Bloomer was, and there are, and I cut back on it because I didn't want to throw like 500 images of all these women at you. We talk about the 4, the 8, maybe the 10 women who are most involved in this or who are the most famous about this. But there were, I'd venture to say, hundreds of women that, of all kinds, black women, Native American women, later Asian women, white women who were involved in this all over the world. And our concentration is the United States, in the United States. But to throw all of these at you, we forgot the puzzle again. So,
I'll have to do it next week.
oh, okay. So okay. Any of you like to do puzzles, jigsaw puzzles? So somebody gave us this jigsaw puzzle that's, first of all, it's round, so it's kind of interesting. Secondly, it's this. It's the women's rights movement in this puzzle. It's very interesting. Kelly will bring it in to show it to you.
I have to make sure it doesn't fall apart on the way
Right.
down. I have to go around and do that.
But, and there, again, and the point being, there are many, many names. I don't want you to think there's only like 8 or 10 women that we talk about. There's very many women. But we're trying to hold it down to the most important. Amelia Bloomer was, I thought, particularly interesting at this point because not only was she a typical housewife, as we used to call that, who became involved in the movement and got much more militant about it, but she invented clothing, which is, I think, the most interesting part, that she encouraged women to wear when they were going out to picket and to do all these other things, because it was very easy to wear. And what happened is they started to call it bloomerisms. And this was the outfit that she came up with. It's like pants with a skirt over it. And they were called bloomerisms. And it's where we get our word. I think sometimes that people will refer to underwear, the ladies' underwear, as bloomers. I think that's where it came from too. So I just thought that was funny. That was interesting. Next, we have, so what I want to spend a little bit of time on now is exactly the nuts and bolts of what was going on with this movement west. What did that mean? We know that, most importantly, not from the point of the women's rights, although it does apply, but most importantly in general, when all of North Americans, usually white European people, Euro-American people, were moving to the West, it wasn't like the West was empty. There were many Native American peoples and Native American tribes that had lived there literally for 1,000 years or more. But there were a lot of Mexicans who lived there too, because the Mexican Empire, the Mexican Empire and then the Mexican Republic, which took over from the Spanish Empire in America, was huge. It went all the way up to the border of Oregon, took all of California, all of the western states that we talk about now, Nevada and Texas and all of those states that you see on the left.
Arizona and New Mexico.
Arizona and New Mexico. So when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was over and signed, and then, by the way, there was a preamble to it where a lot of the territory that was in dispute, the United States just bought. It was called, if you remember from your 9th grade history, the Gadsden Purchase. You remember that? It was a little strip that wasn't included in the treaty, and the Americans just said, well, we're going to buy it. We'll buy it to make the whole thing sea to shining sea. That's what they wanted. So it opened up an amazing amount of territory. And one of the first ways to get to this was something called the Oregon Trail. No, the Oregon Trail.
I think we did it
Oh,
already.
we did the trail, okay.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's showing too many
I know, I was
pictures.
looking for it.
And with the invention, so you have all these things happening together, and what's happening as well, we saw a little bit of it with the Erie Canal. What's happening as well is inventions of machines, different methods, etc., that contributed to the ease of this, and it wasn't easy. I don't mean to suggest it was easy, but the feasibility of moving west in great numbers, and also not by design, but it contributed to the decrease of the ability of Native Americans and Mexicans living there to either conform to what was going on, to live with what was going on, or if they were so inclined to push back about what was going on. They didn't stand a chance, is what I'm saying, even though there were so many more Native Americans at first. One of the major contributions to this, of course, was the railroad train, the train. Invented in Great Britain earlier on in the 1830s and 40s. It was eventually brought back to the United States. This was one of the principal trains that was used. If you're a train freak, like a lot of people I know, certainly not me, but a lot of people I know, the Union Pacific train number 119 is like the gem of gems. You know, they made this train incredibly efficient, was able to pull a lot of cars, translate that into pull a lot of stuff to be sold, pull a lot of people moving out west, and almost impervious to breaking down. It very rarely broke down, which is different than wagons. When the wagons used to come out, breaking down was one of the problems. And also the train saved a lot of people from disease. Now in the middle of our pandemic that we've been talking about forever, it seems, there was a cholera epidemic around the 1840s, 1850s in the United States. It was brought over from European immigrants who were coming to the United States, and it spread like wildfire, particularly in the West, particularly where people were all bunched together coming out west in these wagon trains. So the train prevented a little bit of that. By the same token, the train would provide a vehicle, pun intended, where sports hunters on the train would be able to shoot animals from the train in the convenience of their train. They'd just be sitting, taking target practice, etc. And what happened with that is that it led to the perpetration of the elimination of the buffalo in the West. Now, why was that significant, that the buffalo were decimated?
Native Americans used the hides and the food.
Native Americans absolutely depended almost 80-90% on the buffalo. They ate the meat, they used the hides, they used the bones for tools and weapons, they used the horns for weapons. It had religious significance. I mean, the buffalo was their life. So with the elimination, see how things reflect upon other things, with the elimination of the herds of buffalo, and they used to describe, writers would describe buffalo herds when they came, of being so big that they sometimes were over 2 states. One buffalo herd took up 2 states.
Wow.
Or across the borders of 2 states. Just thousands, tens of thousands, and they were just being killed. Now, the hunters weren't using the meat necessarily because the train was moving. They just for the fun of shooting the buffalo. So that was another condition.
Okay.
At the same time as the railroad was making its impact in the West, another invention, the telegraph. Now, again, what miracle of science that we can lay these wires, because that's what they were, that's what the guy on the pole is doing. They're putting up poles, and if you see the poles are near what? Railroad tracks. Because as the train was being built out west, it was easier, safer, if we can put up the telegraph along the same route. Cheaper, because the telegraph companies didn't have to dig their own routes, R-O-U-T-E-S, out west. They could just go along the railroads. If you saw, as I did when I was a kid, I used to watch, my father was a devotee of Westerns, cowboy pictures. He loved them. He would watch it, the same movie. Dad, you saw this? Oh, I don't think so. The 8th or 9th time he saw it, he would see it. I remember, the guy invariably, this poor sap on the top invariably would be killed by an Indian. He's gone. I would say after a while, I'd say, see the guy on the, forget about it, he's gone. And invariably, yes, they'd find him. He'd be hanging on the ball. But the telegraph, literally, when it was done, you can send a message from New York to California. Almost instantly. Now, in the age where we're all carrying these things around, you know, I tell my students all the time, it's like having a major library in your pocket, and it is. There's no doubt about it. It's a pain in the neck sometimes, but no doubt about it. That was the same effect as this. That all of a sudden you could communicate, you know, the dots and the dashes, which was not hard to learn, and people would be able to talk to each other. Wonderful innovation, yes. For the Native Americans, not so much. For even some of the Mexicans, not so much. And then later on, we are going to talk about Chinese immigration from China to the West Coast, and what would happen with that, and men and women, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the so again, I want to emphasize railroad and telegraph at the same time. The major pluses and the major minuses. And then the stuff hits the fan, so to speak. All during the 1840s and the late 1840s and the 1850s. The United States was heading, I mean, we know all this now in hindsight, but I always find it fascinating about how it happened and how it developed. So the argument was always, had very often been between the slave states in the South and the North. The states in the North that had no slavery. Now, it would be a mistake to say that the North never had any slavery, because they did for a while. It would also be a mistake to think that some Southerners benefited greatly from slavery economically, but Northerners didn't. That's not true either. Like the drug epidemic in the United States today, very, very many groups and very, very many peoples had a hand in slavery, made money from slavery. May not have owned slaves, but made money from it. So there's a very, very interesting scene in a kind of corny movie, a musical about the American Revolution.
1776.
1776. You know the scene? Remember the scene?
Exactly.
Where they're arguing now. So it's a musical, which I
Right.
think is kind of weird to begin with. But they're in the Senate room, and they're arguing about the Declaration. And the argument is between Southern representatives from Carolina and Georgia, etc., and John Adams and the New England crowd, and Thomas Jefferson, who's in the middle. He's a Southerner, he's a slave owner, but he wrote the Declaration. That's a whole other story. And in I think it was a very dramatic, very poignant scene. This one Southern guy, in a song, of course, which again, forget about that, but in a song, really dictates how much the North made in money from slavery. Like, you're against slavery, but you New Englanders, he's pointing to John Adams in particular, he says, you New Englanders, you make all your money in shipping and stuff like that through slavery. If you ever get a chance to see that scene, it's very good. I think you'll enjoy get a better sense of it. This is all culminating. Do you have a question?
No.
Oh.
No, I didn't know if you were going to change the slide.
Not yet. This is all culminating in this big election. We're in the midst of a pretty significant election ourselves. So it's kind of funny, like the pandemic we have, and the election like the election we have. But there was this very, very significant election coming up in 1860 between this guy, Abraham Lincoln, from the brand new Republican Party, same Republican Party that we have now, the GOP. He is only the second candidate from the party. The party had formed a few years before him. And another guy that we're going to be looking at later on, a guy by the name of John Fremont, very much associated with California. And again, we'll be talking about him and his wife in particular. Fremont was the first ever candidate of the Republican Party, and he lost. But this guy was the second. And it was a very, very brutal contest between him and the Democrat. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, as we know, won. Now, the South had said, it had come to the point where the South had said, if this guy's elected, we're leaving the Union. What do you mean you're leaving? We're leaving the Union. And sure enough, he's elected, and states begin to secede from the Union, and the Civil War begins. And we'll talk a little bit about women in the Civil War in a little while too. You can do next. At the same time as this is happening, this is like, because it's not only the book that she wrote, but because it's a woman, obviously. A lady by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Probably one of the most significant American works of literature, maybe ever in American history. It was, we would say today it was a bestseller because thousands of people read it. Because thousands of people, if they didn't read it, knew about it. And it was her take about, obviously, Uncle Tom's Cabin, about slavery in the South. And she just brought it very, very much to the fore. She made it very, very public and very, very dramatic. Okay. Another book, I don't think about books in those days, but people, especially in the upper class, the upper middle class, were book readers, were very literate, and books would circulate. I mean, there weren't any movies, there wasn't the internet, people read books more often. This lady, Harriet Jacobs, black woman, wrote another very, very famous book at the time, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. How strange is that? Like a slave actually being literate enough to write and to be able to do this. Now, if you remember when we talked about Douglas, why am I blanking on his first name? Frederick, thank you. Frederick, it was a test. Man, that was it. Frederick Douglass had learned to write. Why is it significant that Frederick Douglass or this lady knew how to write or read? Why was it significant? Oh, I'm asking you. Why was it significant?
Was she
Slaves
was
aren't
free
allowed
or
to.
she was a slave herself?
She was a slave too. Yeah, it says, you know, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl.
Slaves aren't allowed to learn to.
I'm
You gotta
sorry,
raise
go
your
ahead.
hand like
Okay,
everybody else.
slaves were property to certain eyes, and why should they learn to read and write? They're not there to read and write, they're there to do this chore, that chore in the house.
It was even worse, yes, but it was even worse than that. On some plantations, if you taught a slave, because there's some women who had slaves, particularly house slaves, who, kids and younger people, who would teach them their letters and teach them how to read. If you taught a slave how to read, it was a punishable offense. But Douglas and people like that learned how to read because either they had masters who were complacent enough or felt importantly enough, or maybe wanted them to read to increase their worth as a slave. You know, it was an economic reason. Oh, he can read. You know, he can do books for you and stuff like that. Whatever. But taught him how to read. And Douglas was also a great writer and a speaker. Became an incredible speaker. The same was true with Miss Jacobs. And she wrote this, which again permeated throughout the North and other places, and led to, and particularly in the North, but everywhere, this feeling that slavery was just not a good thing. You know, people were indifferent to it. They were becoming more, well, they were losing their indifference. They were starting to take a stand against it. So she was very, very significant that way.
Was she a slave?
Yes, yeah, it says, go back there. Incidents in the life of a slave girl.
Okay,
It's her, I should have said in the beginning, it's based on her own experience.
okay.
Yeah. Right, it could have been somebody else, but it was based on her experience. Yep. So we mentioned John Fremont. Fremont was, well, we would probably call him this day now, in retrospect, a pioneer. He had gone to California early on, even before the gold rush. He tried to make his fortune in California. He was very, very politically oriented. He was, like I say, the first candidate of the Republican Party. It's a good trivial question. You know, who was the first ever Republican? This guy. This is him. But as significant, maybe more so, was his wife, Jessie Benton Fremont. Her parents, I believe, were slave owners, or were sympathetic to slaves. But once they moved out west, she was a great facilitator for Fremont's career. She really sold her husband and propagated how great he was and all this stuff. A lot like what you do.
Were they from the South, I assume?
No, they were born in the North. They were born in the North. But she was very, very significant. I would call her a political woman at the time, although she never ran for office herself. But like I say, she propagated what were at the time Republican causes. And remember, the Republican Party in those days, the GOP, same party, was very, very much anti-slave. Very, very much anti-slave. They fought against it. They fought against it literally during the Civil War. They were very much involved in the planning, and many of them became generals in the North. And of course, Abraham Lincoln speaks for himself. Now, Abraham Lincoln, interestingly too, remember the Mexican War. There were some prominent Americans. Frederick Douglass was one. Abraham Lincoln was the other, that were very, very anti the Mexican War. And he was in Congress at the time, and he spoke against it. Now, it was very unpopular to be against it. The Mexican War was very, very popular in the United States, public opinion. But he was one of those people who was dead set against it. Okay. Southern lady, and again, we're talking about people. So, let me back up for a second. So one of the more complicated, if not most complicated, things about talking about the women's movement in the United States is, and I'm sure you've realized this already. If you didn't know it by now, you know it now. Was that there were so many conflicts within the women's movement. And many of those conflicts were racial, as we talked about the last time, and we're going to do more of that. Blacks and whites, Mexicans and Asians in the West, etc., very much more racial. But also some of it was economic status, whether women were upper class, middle class, lower class, poor. Had a lot to do with it, particularly even into the early 20th century. And a lot of it too was the North-South thing. And this lady was a lady of the South who wrote, her claim to fame was she wrote a diary, Mary Chestnut's Confederate Diary, which was significant in and of itself. Later on, well into the 1960s, I think, a very prominent American male historian, did a rewrite of a book. He didn't rewrite it, he published it, he republished it, and it became even more famous in our modern time. But she is very, very much quoted for her observations during the Civil War. Not always, she was a proud Southerner, very, very much in favor of the Confederacy, but she was honest about how she talked about slavery and things like that. So another significant book, coupled with the ones we talked about, very, very, very significant. Mary Livermore was also a woman who was very, very involved in the early Civil War, the early battles of the Civil War. She would be involved in, she didn't become a nurse herself, but she would be involved in raising money for nursing and for those kinds of things during the Civil War. Another figure that I wanted to identify. Clara Barton, we know about, a nurse. Clara Barton is the lady who founds the Red Cross,
Yes.
finds the American Red Cross. There was a Red Cross in Europe already, but she establishes, I guess was a good word. She establishes the American Red Cross. And she was, now these were ladies who would go to the front. A lot of times they weren't allowed to actually go to the battle scenes, the battle sites. But there were hospitals, makeshift hospitals in the Civil War all the time. And a word about that, all war is terrible in terms of loss of life and wounds and that kind of stuff. The Civil War was particularly cruel about that for a number of reasons. I just want to point them out. Weapons had been invented by this time, rifles, etc., that had much bigger caliber bullets. So a lot of times, if a man was shot anywhere from here to the knees, anywhere, they could die easily. Or if you remember, if you see Civil War movies, they cut off a guy's arms or legs like at the drop of a hat. You know, the only way to save him is cut off his leg. They cut off his leg, he dies anyway. You know, whatever. But those kinds of wounds could be deadly wounds. You want some water?
I can't get water.
Okay. And Clara Barton was in the thick of it in terms of that, and started to establish a lot of the keynote kinds of things that would be used by nurses later on in other wars. She was a real innovator about that. We saw her before, and I just wanted to mention her again. During the Civil War, was a figure who would raise money, not so much a nurse in the field or anything, but would raise money for the troops, would do all kinds of, remember the religious aspects of this. Religion, interestingly enough, religion and churches were on both sides of this issue, which is, you wouldn't think that, but they were. Recently, for example, the Catholic Church was tagged at Notre Dame, prominent Catholic university, because they had slaves, and they sold slaves, and they used slaves.
It was George.
Not Notre Dame, Georgetown. I'm
Georgetown.
sorry, Georgetown University. Because they had slaves. Makes me mad because it's a Jesuit school and I was Jesuit trained, so it makes me particularly mad. But for slavery, for selling slaves, and that was true of everybody: Christian churches, Jewish organizations, Jewish conventions, etc. But anyway, she would raise money for some of these causes, and she's also one of the four leaders of the women's movement in the United States.
Okay.
Yep.
That's it.
What?
That was it.
That was it?
Yeah.
Okay, that was it. Questions? Yes,
I
ma'am.
just can't believe how the women lived very long, most of the ones you showed us.
Yes,
they lived
yes, we
long,
commented on
yeah.
that, we commented on it too when we were looking up there, the
And-
born in death thing.
Is there any background about, I don't know if some of them or all of them or none of them married, and what their husbands or male family members thought about them participating in this and pushing rights?
Yes. It's a good question, I should have mentioned in the beginning. For the most part, their husbands, for most of these women, I would not say the same about the black women, but for most of these white women, the big four, the big six that we're talking about, their men. Their husbands were either very supportive or didn't say much. I think it was, not Caddy Stanton, Mott. I think it was Lucretia Mott's. No, I'm sorry, it was Caddy Stanton. She wrote the Declaration.
Yes.
Caddy Stanton's husband asked her not to print it. saw it was written, understood where she was coming from, but said, I'd rather you didn't print it. She said, sorry, I'm gonna print it. And I think that really, not destroyed their marriage, but made it much less as beneficial as it used to be. But for the most part, they either they weren't married, or they ignored their husbands, or their husbands ignored them pretty much. They did what they were going to do, and they were fine as long as they didn't embarrass them.
It's like the women's lib movement in the 60s.
Yes, very much so. We're going to get to that at the very end. What's this?
No, go ahead.
Oh, we're going to get to that at the very end. The other thing that there was, that lesbianism was becoming much more, I won't say prominent, but it was becoming a little bit more public. I mean, there were some women that weren't married because they inclined towards being lesbians, or they just weren't inclined to get married, They just opted not to be with a man. It was easier not to be with a man.
Way back then.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Oh, yeah. Anything else? So the next time, we are going to talk about the conflicts that I mentioned in more detail, a little bit more detail. What I'm particularly interested in, I hope you'll be interested in too, is that whole difference between white women, black women, the different like upper class women, lower class women, like how, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which we're going to probably talk about at the end, the last session, which was defeated, and a lot of the reason it was defeated was there was a lot of pushback by women, if you remember. The same thing was true here. There were a lot of women who were anti this whole idea. I don't want the vote. I don't want to be equal with men in that regard. I don't want to have to bear the burden of working outside of the home, necessarily. I'm good the way I am. Leave me alone. Leave me the heck alone. Well, how do you feel about being underclass? I said, no, I'm good. I'm good. And there were a lot of women who felt very, very strongly about that too. So that's another conflict that we'll be talking about. Any other questions or comments?
I assume the bottom of that slide are the signatories?
Yes,
Yes.
Okay.
it was hard to make it so big, so.
Signers of the Declaration of Sentiments. So I'm looking, and it's mostly men, and mostly women. Mostly, there's a William,
I can't see, it's hard to see.
Rachel Elizabeth stuff. There's a Frederick Douglass, of course. Thomas, Jonathan. I think it's something like, in the whole conference, like 30 men. Like a couple hundred women, 30 men. Which was, at the time, a lot.
Yeah.
A lot of men should have attended that.
What was really accomplished there?
Popularity, advertising, like they made it very public.
Right, making
It was very, very much behind the scenes. People didn't talk about it. Some men, to answer your question, some men were embarrassed. They didn't want to talk about it. But this made it very, very public across at least the half the country. From the middle to the east of the country, and then people started to learn about it. The two books I mentioned made the issue even stronger in different parts of the United States. We didn't mention this today, but we'll talk about it a little bit more maybe next week, is that all this stuff leading up to the Civil War, there were two great issues in particular. One was a court case called the Dred Scott decision. Remember that? So essentially what happened was a slave was brought to the North. He sued because he thought he was free, because he went to free territory. The head of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was a Southern sympathizer and ruled against him, which caused a great furor in the North in particular. So I guess the overarching theme is these underlying conflicts between the slave states, the northern states, all this stuff, are coming in the last 10 years before the Civil War starts, 15, even I would say even from 1840 on, these things are becoming much more public, and people are starting to take a stand against them. They're starting to have an opinion. And the thing that used to drive me crazy is that you ask somebody something and say, no, I have no opinion. Or the people who, like, 4 days ago were like, no, I haven't made up my mind on who I'm gonna vote for. You haven't made up your mind? Drives me absolutely nuts. And what was happening from the 1840s on, so 20 years before the Civil War starts, is that people were starting to get very, very much taking a stand, picking a side already. So that was the first thing, Dred Scott. And the second thing was a guy by the name of John Brown. Remember John Brown?
Yeah.
So he leads this raid, and it scares the bejesus out of the South. Because slaveholders were always in almost, I mean, slavery is very old in world history. So what scares a lot of slaveholders all over the world, all over history, is the slaves revolting. There's more of them than there are of us. What if they kill us in our beds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the John Brown thing made a lot of people in the South like crazy about what could happen, et cetera, et cetera.
I grew up in Kansas,
Uh-huh.
and that was a very, like, we thought we were so superior to the people in Missouri next door. Because we were on, like, they didn't,
The right
slavery
side.
was not a thing. I mean, there were documents and stuff, but
Right.
Missouri went a whole different way, and they were more southern aligned. I mean, it's just that water war is still going on, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sports teams, you know, they just wanna kill each other,
Yeah.
you know? It's very bizarre.
You a baseball fan?
Yeah. I like football and I like all of
Yes.
them.
Yeah. Just wondering, because that's, gets heated after a while.
Yes, it does,
Yes.
it does. Especially on college level teams.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes more so.
Yeah.
Yep. Anything else, ladies?
I have
Yes,
to
ma'am.
say, we stumbled upon the museum in Seneca Falls a number of years ago, kind of by mistake,
Yes.
and I schlepped my husband in it. It's really, I mean, it's great. It's a
Yes,
small
before
but
the-
very nice place to visit.
Yes, before the coronavirus hit, we were talking about it.
Right, we're gonna do that this summer.
Doing the Erie Canal and
Yeah, it was a
Seneca
great
Falls.
museum.
Yes.
Kind of a weird little town. It's
Yeah,
quaint, but
right,
the
Yeah,
museum
yeah.
is
Well,
great.
it's, right.
Small.
Yeah, it's definitely on all this, right?
definitely.
Good place to see.
Anything else? Ladies?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.